Today, we're talking about hard truth. America, NATO, and global allies might lose the next war before the first shot is even fired. Not because we lack the best weapons, though. It's because we can't build enough of them fast enough. The wars in Ukraine and the Middle East have exposed something uncomfortable. The side that wins isn't the one that's got the most exquisite platform. It's the one that can produce, replace, and adapt at scale. China makes roughly 90% of the world's drones. Ukraine builds millions a year. And the United States, the most advanced military on Earth, is still trying to figure out the paperwork. Here to help us understand and solve this challenge is my guest today, Brett Freedman. He has spent nearly 2 decades at the highest levels of American national security. He was a lawyer at NSA, general counsel to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. He worked at the White House. He was the chief of staff at the Department of Justice's National Security Division. And today he leads emerging technology at the Institute for Critical Infrastructure Technology. And he's been sounding the alarm that our biggest vulnerability isn't intelligence or strategy. It's that we may have forgotten how to build things quickly. Let's get to it. Brett, you've been sounding the alarm on the drone gap in defense manufacturing. You've written that the next major war will be decided on the factory floor, not by our smartest algorithms or our most sophisticated platforms. How does a national security lawyer end up convinced that America's biggest vulnerability is that we can't build things fast enough?
Honestly, I think it's generally due to the pace at which things are happening overseas, particularly in Ukraine, the absence, at least prior to kind of recent engagements by this administration, the absence of making decisions at the pace of technological innovation, and the flipping, if you will, of private versus public funding, right? In the history, you had, say, the Manhattan Project, where you had a bringing together of an enormous amount of resources and money and the smartest folks towards a singular mission. That will not happen now. And in fact, most of the efforts are trying to almost bring in private sector innovation without sacrificing IP, for instance, but allowing for the government to kind of capitalize off of that. And so I think that we're kind of hopping along. And in the meantime, you're seeing an iterative construct in Ukraine, in Iran, almost on an hourly basis, if not daily, that is, I think, unprecedented, but is obviously the future of both warfare and, I think, unfortunately, probably non-state actors as well in terms of terrorist activity.
We don't control the scale of production needed to fight modern wars effectively. It's just a reality. And so we now are in a situation, for example, where China makes 90+% of global drones. So 9 out of 10 drones made globally, Beijing controls that, right? And then if you look, for example, at Russia and Iran, there's a sizable portion of that remaining 10% built there. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of capacity globally being made by the United States right now. And we've seen policymakers call for 10,000, 30,000, 50,000 drones being manufactured a month. But how do we get to something like that?
I mean, it almost takes a whole, I get averse to the term, but a whole of government, but a whole of society kind of push. I think that part of it is the human nature. We are reactionary, and unfortunately, even Operation Spider's Web, which demonstrated the ability to kind of outreach and reach an adversary deep within their country, didn't happen here. We are, whether we like it or not, feeling as if we're kind of protected by the oceans. I think that there's been an absence of truly thinking through what is needed, because as you note, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 drones, that's great. But if the day after they're deployed, that technology is obsolete or has moved on, they're just as good as, a dead drone or a destroyed drone. So I think that it's not numbers, it's innovation, and it's the ability the responsiveness to kind of dictate on the battlefield what is necessary and what is being seen, and finding ways to innovate almost immediately and then deploy that potential solution. And I don't think that we've never been particularly good at that, honestly, unless we are faced with, in a way, an existential threat like World War II. We just had the 250th, and we have the ongoing World Cup. I am fascinated. I mean, I would have thought that this would be something that is going to, even if it's a drone that inadvertently flies over, drops, sugar from its contents, white powder, whatever it might be. It's not a mass casualty aspect that I'm concerned with. It's the economic impact and the direct panic that would ensue, and the inability from government to be able to protect from the public's perspective. So I think that if that were to happen, or when that unfortunately kind of event happens, you're going to have a mobilization and a throwing of resources similar to post 9/11.
A former CIA buddy said that if Tesla can build 500,000 cars out of one factory, we should be able to build 10,000 Tomahawks as a nation. But instead, we're making about 90 Tomahawks a year. You mentioned drone fleets. You mentioned Operation Spiderweb, which was Ukraine's long-range attack into Russia with fleets of drones. Each one of those drones being deployed creates huge economic costs for the defense industrial base in the United States. Millions of dollars for an interceptor being used to target a $20,000 or $30,000 Iranian Shaheed. That math will never make sense for the American taxpayer. And you mentioned the defense industrial base is just not structured right now in the United States to manufacture that amount of those amounts of drones. And just because China makes 90% of the global drones, that doesn't mean that the rest of the global industry isn't reliant on certain parts from China for those other 10%. Right. So I think about batteries, for example. It's a choke point technology. We could throw all the money in the world at this problem domestically, and we would still struggle to come up with the critical minerals, the rare earths that are needed to manufacture some of these very efficient, small batteries for drones. So China still controls a lot of these underlying choke points. So from your perspective, when industry and when VCs are thinking about this problem, there's been an uptick, certainly. Jamie Dimon even has called on JP Morgan to spend billions of dollars on the reindustrialization of the defense industrial base for the United States. Where do you see some of that money being most effective?
It's a good question, Kit. I think there's a variety. I don't think there's one solution. I think that there's going to need to be a willingness and an ability to try and fail. And I think that inevitably, in the context of startup environments or kind of new next generation defense tech, there's been a significant uptick, whether you talk about the Anduril's of the world or other entities. There is a subset, and I was encouraged by. I recently attended a conference in Detroit by the Autonomous Vehicle Institute. AUVSI is their lengthy acronym. Michael Robbins is their CEO. And it was a wonderful example, tremendous outpouring, very defense oriented, although in the past it was much more of a almost 50-50, I've been told, as it relates to the commercial versus the defense oriented. And I think that there's not a clear delineation between the two. The technologies that are going to be utilized in both instances are going to be helpful and codependent for purposes of ramping up manufacturing. And you're going to need to kind of string together the ability to manufacture, quickly, and transport that manufacturing capability. Because, for instance, the Ukraine, you hear about factories being stood up, and they're putting out tens of thousands of drones. Those factories are somebody's bedroom or somebody's basement, right? That is what is being done, and they are kludging together and making sure that they are getting what is necessary because it's a life or death situation. We have the benefit of being able to kind of anticipate and put resources, I fear, and I think I posted yesterday as it relates to the most significant personnel development, I think, as it relates to the defense industrial base, has been the the creation by Secretary Hegseth of this drone czar, if you will, bringing together the air, land, sea, for not entirely 100%, but the degree to which that is consolidated, that is bringing together the prior entities that were working on autonomous systems, and then the discretion and the ability to enter into contracts, bring their own people on, and have a 30,000 foot perspective across the enterprise. I think it's going to be critical as to who that individual is going to be there, and then how they go about, because the framework, the scaffolding is there. It's going to be a question of implementation.
There's almost an incentive by the government for drones to take a policy playbook from the critical minerals work that's happening around the entire government right now, where there's agreed offtake agreements at a certain price for specific types of minerals. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, looking at the drone industrial base, is something like that needed in order to break free some of these choke points, like, for example, Chinese batteries?
I'd have to give it some more thought, but my initial gut reaction is yes, and I think that would be something that you could also, because it's not just the build out of drones. There's the components associated and the counter drone technology, which is a constant kind of push and pull, if you will. And so, like for instance, there were companies that ran to Ukraine to help. It was a ability to deploy your systems and showcase whether or not they were actually useful. Many of them, many of the large scale producers here, they were useless in the context of a battlefield, particularly given the RF and the counter signaling capacity, intercepting and making those drones inert essentially almost prior to takeoff, where they just couldn't, either they were cutting off the ability to communicate, or they were basically making them useless. And so that leads me to think that there's a larger ecosystem with a greater degree of engineers and thinking that needs to go into both. You think about the capabilities, and there needs to be some semblance of certainty, at least at a break-even point of, okay, if we're going to do this, we know this is the baseline that we can get for what we're producing, and that will lead to, I think, other entities going in that are not just the VC entities, that are not just the more private sector, that I think are more the foundational institutions. You mentioned Jamie Dimon, and there's a reindustrialization writ large, drones being a significant part of that movement, that I think is really facilitating and ought to be directly facilitating a partnership between the public and the private sectors.
Yeah, I love that. And switching gears, I want to touch on your background, which is incredible. You've worked at the White House, NSA, General Counsel at the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. You've seen these policy challenges from the front row. Very few people have worked in those three organizations. And not to mention that you were also responsible for leading the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. So you've got a very wide enterprising look at some of these issues from a policy perspective. And so let's touch on a couple of things that have been in the news recently, to include some challenges with Congress and the reauthorization of FISA, and specifically 702. Can you walk us through what FISA 702 is, and what's happening right now and why it matters?
It's one of the most important national security authorities, and at the same time, it's one of the most complicated to understand and fully be able to educatedly put a perspective forward. And that's a problem, particularly when you're talking about sound bites and 30-second, YouTube videos, and the ability to go onto the floor of the Congress and speak educatedly about this. So it increases the degree to which you can get misinformation, and you add to that the classified nature of the authority. You can say whatever it is that you want, and the government's not oftentimes going to be able to necessarily push back on that, even though the reality is probably quite different. So in essence, in a very basic ability, it's the government's utilization of post 9/11 of our domestic technological innovation, primarily media companies, telecommunications service providers, to utilize that, what I refer to as home field advantage, to be able to intercept and gather those communications that are relevant to individuals that are overseas, foreigners, and have no constitutional protections, to get that information, collate it, understand where the risks are, who's talking to who, all of that. And the kind of the paradox is that you're using the home field advantage to get overseas communications. And part of that is simply because the nature of signaling, the nature of communications traversing the internet. You're an individual in Islamabad and you're sending a note to a friend on Google. That note could potentially, and oftentimes does, traverse the entirety of the global environment. It could be the quickest way to do it, ironically, and that element allows for the government to be able to get access to that communication. And so there's questions about, well, wait a second, are there U.S. persons involved in that? What are their constitutions? How do you know these individuals are determined to be overseas? I will say, without getting too far into the details here, that it is probably the most overseen and diligently multifaceted compliance environment across all branches of government. I've seen it from a variety of perspectives, from NSA, from the Hill, from the Justice Department. And so I don't have a greater degree of confidence in the compliance. And I will also say that the value of it is demonstrated by what has publicly been released as well over 50% of the elements that are in the intelligence, the presidential daily brief, that which is of utmost daily importance to decision makers, emanates from, in some way, shape, or form, 702 related data. And it gets more complicated, but I cannot tell you how critical this authority is and how nervous I am that we're basically taking away that at the very instance in which our country is probably, we're in adversarial action, as with yesterday, back again in Iran, and there's not a dearth of individuals or groups or countries that want to do us harm. And so this authority is critical.
And you mentioned during your explanation of the FISA challenges, your time at the Department of Justice, the National Security Division. 702 obviously and the intelligence collected by 702 is used to monitor everything from terrorist groups like Al Qaeda to ISIS and other threats all around the world. So DOJ obviously is responsible for an equally large number of these national security related issues, and that intelligence informs some of that activity. And you spent a lot of time at the Department of Justice, and you spent a lot of time leading the National Security Division. And so when I think about the National Security Division, I'm always blown away by the scale of its size and its impact. And I don't think it's very well understood, even within the United States government or within allied governments, but certainly not within industry, about how important the National Security Division is for everything related to economic security, far beyond the traditional counterintelligence, chasing spies or prosecuting terrorists. It's far more substantive than that. And so I wanted to get your opinion on a few things. The first broadly is about DOJ as an enforcement arm for economic security. And for a business audience, what does the National Security Division do, and why should a CEO pay attention?
Well, first off, let me preface, yes, I would not say that I led, because as Chief of Staff, Matt Olson, who was the Assistant Attorney General, would probably turn his head and say, what are you representing? So I want to be sure and say that at the outset. But it's about 400 attorneys. You are entirely correct that the National Security Division created as an aggregation of what was intelligence related entities in the pre 9/11 context, brought together a whole host of entities that are essentially work hand in glove on the criminal side, work on counter espionage operations, counterterrorism, as you noted, but increasingly it is becoming an area that is ripe for prosecution in the enforcement of an increasingly utilized tool like economic sanctions. Folks have, and probably familiar with, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, the Foreign Investment Review Section, or commonly referred to as FIRS, within the Department of Justice, works closely with the interagency environment. It's led by Treasury, but they review any engagement in its broadening in recent years, whereby there are potential acquisitions or investments by adversaries, by overseas countries in sensitive technologies, in areas that have classified contracts with contractors, for instance. It could be as simple as co-location or the purchasing of real estate adjacent to a military base. And that has been expanded to look at the reverse, so-called reverse CFIUS of entities that are essentially looking overseas, the exfiltration, if you will, of data and looking at data security, primarily personally identifiable information, biologic information. And then there's the team telecom side of things. So cable environment, spectrum, whereby the Department of Justice, the FIRS group, work very closely with other entities, particularly the FCC in this context, to be able to utilize significant and broad enforcement components and prosecutorial discretion to be able to either prevent a transaction from going forward, to unwind a transaction that has already been consummated, and that is relying upon experienced prosecutors who have a degree of understanding and knowledge of this area, clear and constant communication amongst the various agencies that are a part of this. That's both the national security side, but the commercial side, USTR, Commerce. It is a large-scale undertaking, but from an industry perspective, the Department of Justice is an unsung and very critical component to be able to best understand supply chain security. They are, if you look at every executive order, the Department of Justice is part of that interagency conversation, and it's not unintentional. And that is, I think, a critical component that the industry needs to be increasingly aware of.
And moreover, there's real penalties, both civil
Yes,
and criminal penalties that can be issued by the department,
no
and
question.
in partnership with other interagency partners, like you mentioned, Commerce for export controls. I'm reminded of a recent case where a German company, Bosch, was fined $36 million for exporting technology that was export controlled to Huawei illegally. And DOJ was intimately involved in that. And in fact, there was as part of that $36 million penalty, very large, they self-disclosed some of this to the Department of Justice. They
Yes.
self-disclosed, they raised their hand and said, hey, we made a mistake. We accidentally sent a bunch of stuff that we shouldn't have to Huawei in violation of US export control law. And they still got a $36 million penalty. And I imagine if you were a CEO looking at that fine, that's significant, but it's better than paying a $100 million fine and ending up in jail on top of that, which is something that I think industry sometimes forgets, where DOJ and the National Security Division in particular, and assistant U.S. attorneys all over the United States will work and prosecute export control and sanctions violation cases, and they will throw people in jail. Every week we see cases like this, so it's always good to be reminded about that. I want to close with one broader question. There's been a lot of discussion over the last few years on economic security, and we had President Biden and we've had President Trump now say that economic security is national security. That's not
Hmm.
necessarily new, but what is new is this idea that certain departments, certain divisions within certain departments, like you mentioned, the National Security Division at the Department of Justice, you have other elements like Commerce and others, right? Where this mission for economic security is bits and pieces here, bits and pieces there. There's been some chatter about creating a Department of Economic Security where all of these interagency organizations can theoretically come together. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I wanted to get your thoughts on whether or not something like that could make sense. If not now, maybe in the future.
That's an active and a long-standing question. I remember being on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and there were questions of making elements of commerce within the Bureau of Industry and Security, bring them within and add an element to the intelligence community, if you will. I think there's utility in that. The difficulty is that, without not dismissing this, but I think that national security encompasses everything now. Whether you think about the intellectual property associated with the color white of paint, to seeds and the genetic makeup of seeds in the agricultural sector, you could see elements of the intelligence community being in any agency across the government. So I think we need to be sensitized to that and understand that there is a national security component to issues when you bring them up. I think in the economic security side of things, it's certainly a hot button topic. I think that it's very live, particularly with regards to frontier models on the AI side of things at present. But in the interim, China's not sitting back and letting things just happen. They're innovating. And so I think that there's utility. I don't know if it would be a Department of Economic Security, to get to your question. I think it could be more in the context of either existing entities like CFIUS, or having a National Security Council driven process that would bring together and look at economic security in a broader context, because there's every entity kind of puts its imprimatur on a particular, what they view as the most important aspect. And you can see in a vacuum, like currently, where you have a dearth of activity, particularly in the CFIUS context and otherwise, because of interagency dynamics, FCC comes in and says, hey, wait a second, we're going to be issuing, whether it be on the drone side of things, on edge devices, who knows where they go next, routers, right? They've done that in a way that has risen their optic and their importance in the private sector. And I think that that's being done, at least the perception from the public side, is without kind of a formalized understanding and tactic and strategy amongst the administration. And so I think that there needs to be some greater degree of coordination. Whether or not that's a department, I hesitate to think that, creating another, particularly when we're having trouble with the existing structure and the Department of Homeland Security, which I was a part of when it started, still, having its growing pains is another question entirely.
Awesome. Yeah, good stuff. All right. I always end on this. What's
Yeah.
your favorite book that you've read recently?
Honestly, I think it has to be The Emperor of All Maladies. I'm going to butcher the name of the author, but Siddhartha Mukherjee, a physician. And it basically looks at the evolution from the beginning of cancer as an entity, treatment, different innovations, looks at actually the kind of, in an interesting way, the politics in a very readable format that I've found to be surprising to me, the page turning aspect of the issue, and also gave me a bit of optimism, honestly, as to where we're going. And going back to AI and machine learning and quantum and innovative technology is kind of the healthcare related innovations that could come about. And I'm excited about that. So I highly recommend.
Love it. Thanks, Brett, for joining us.
Thanks, Kit. Really appreciate it.
That was Brett Freedman, formerly at the White House, NSA, Department of Justice, and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. My takeaway is that the West needs to manufacture and reshore supply chains faster. And it's not just governments, but industry and investors as well. The Pentagon has a new drone czar. Jamie Dimon at JP Morgan is personally overseeing over $100 billion of capital to help close these supply chain choke points. And this investment is critical to help fund a new generation of defense tech companies willing to try and fail. And what it takes now is policymakers with the appetite to accept risk, working with the investors and companies willing to go tackle these choke points. The batteries, the actuators, the components our adversaries still control. The demand signal has never been more clear. The question now is what companies, investors are going to be the first to solve this problem and make billions of dollars along the way. Thanks for listening to the Exiger Exchange. If this one gave you something to think about, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you next time.